Indeed, COVID-19 has beaten so hard many industries, you name it, from hospitality sector, tourism sectors, and also mining sectors. All sectors got beaten so hard by COVID-19. But one thing to underline, there is one industry that got beaten even harder than other industry. It is tourism industry. Well, as we know that tourism industry is the most labor incentive sector in the economy, but however, at the first place, government is actually predicting a good signal in the tourism Indonesia in 2020. Even government has set some goals and also targets in 2020 Indonesia's tourism performance. And therefore, in the first graphic, I would like to elaborate on how governments in 2020 Indonesia tourism goals and targets. Let's see it through the next graphic. Here it is. Through the next graphic, we can see Indonesia tourism sector's goals in 2020 by the government. So government basically trying to proceed domestic tourists by 312 million people. So therefore, this tourism industry had become a major driver of economic and the central feature of the government's economic growth strategy. And to facilitate further growth, for information, Indonesia's government is hoping to replicate success of Bali as a tourist destination in the number of other locations spread across Indonesia. And the next one, we can see that tourism workers, it will employ at least 13 million people. And not to mention about the foreign tourists, government aiming for 18.5 million people in total. Well, for your information, a total of 16.1 million foreign tourists visited Indonesia throughout 2019 was actually falling short of government's target of attracting 20 million tourists. But however, in 2020, we can see that government set less than 20 million people, as it is specifically talk about 18.5 million people. And then regarding to the foreign exchange contributions, tourism sector is hoped to get the foreign exchange contributions by 21 billion US dollar. And one area where Indonesia is looking to boost GDP in the tourism industry, which is among of its promising growth sectors. Here it is, we can see the last point is that tourism is big industry in Indonesia, which the contributions to GDP is expected to be at 4.8%. And tourism in Indonesia is a big business, and a major of area to focus of the governments is the influx of visitors, and particularly for China and Malaysia, and it continues to grow as well. And then the source we gather, it is from the Ministry of Finance in 2020. Well, at some point, actually pinning our high hope is a good reactions, but however, pinning our high hopes is kind of a little bit tricky when it comes to unpredictable conditions. By meaning unpredictable conditions, in this term is the COVID-19 pandemic that we haven't decided yet at the first place. We don't know yet at the first place that COVID-19 pandemic will hit Indonesia and the rest of the world. Well, probably it's really easy actually to notice the downfall of tourism in Indonesia by 2020. And there are some many indicators, but we can see the easiest indicator is by seeing the foreign tourist arrivals are declining in 2020. And Statistic Indonesia and BPS just gathered the data about the foreign tourist arrivals in April 2020, and we compile it to you as a whole in the first quarter of 2020 through the next graphic. Here it is. Through the next graphic, we can see Indonesia's tourist arrival in the first quarter of 2020. Actually, in January, the number is quite fine by more than 1 million arrivals. But then, yeah, when it turns out to be in February, when the coronavirus get hyped the most, the tourist arrival in Indonesia went dropped to be around 800,000 arrivals, and in March it went worse. As it went worse, Indonesia's foreign tourist arrival plunged into 64.11% year-on-year in March to about 470,900, or fewer than a half from the January's number, as you can see through the data. As the coronavirus pandemic discouraged travel and Chinese tourist arrivals slid more than 97% of the yearly basis in March only. And it goes to April. So Statistic Indonesia just bared the data about April foreign tourist arrival, and the number is quite sad. To revive the sector, it is only 160,000 foreign tourist arrival, and indeed, in the number of foreign traveler visiting Indonesia plunged 87.44% year-on-year only in April, as COVID-19 pandemic had led holiday makers to suspend journey. And of course, to revise the sectors, the government has planned to reopen destination spots where the virus infections rate had been low and has been significantly decreased. And the reopening will be carried under the healthy protocols. But we don't know yet about the reopening will be executed yet. Well, actually, we have to appreciate a government move that the government is quite optimistic that Indonesia's tourism will be rebound again in 2021. But let's see. We cannot even deny the fact that Indonesia's tourism industry right now is quite crippled by the COVID-19. But one thing to be underlined is that Indonesia is not alone. There are thousands of countries that have been in the same positions like us, and it hit global tourism as a whole. And same applies with Indonesia. Global tourism downfall, we have to see it as a whole, and it's not really hard to see because in the first quarter of 2020, the global tourism performance went down really bad. So in the next graphic, we can see how is actually the first quarter of 2020 global tourism went away. So here it is through the next graphic. We just wrapped up to you about the international tourism in the first quarter of 2020. In short, it went down by 22% as a whole. And then we can see that got lost in export by 80 billion US dollar. And not to mention about the 67 million fewer international tourists up to March. And the third one is that And the fourth one is that global airline revenue are forecast to drop more than 314 billion in 2020 as the arrival in March dropped sharply by 57%. And Asia Pacific shows loss at 33 million arrivals, which is the biggest than other regions among of all. And then by far, even though the Asia Pacific lost the most, with Asia Pacific is expected to rebound first. Hopefully Indonesia will do the same thing as well. And according to UN WTO panel of experts survey, some recovery is expected in the final quarter of 2020 into early 2021, while the domestic tourism is expected to recover faster than the demand for the international sectors. And indeed, international tourism faces its crisis right now. And as we can see, there's associations, so-called World Tourism Organizations, or we can call it as UN WTO, that predicted the decline in global tourism in 2020 only. There are actually divided into three scenarios. It is ranging from 58% until minus 80%. Through the next graphic, we can see the detail about the predictions of UNWTO. Here it is, International Tourism 2020 scenarios from UNWTO. The first scenario would be the lightest one. International tourism as a whole in 2020 will be minus 58% if the restriction easing in July. There is a note about that. And then the second scenario is that the national tourism in 2020 will be in minus 70% as the restrictions easing in September. And then also, in the third scenario, there is minus 78% if the restrictions easing in the last year, which is on December. But by this far, the worst crisis international tourism has faced since record began in 1950, and the impact will be felt to varying degrees in different global regions and at the overlapping times, with Asia Pacific hopefully expected to rebound first. And the organization scenarios on the impact of pandemic of whole 2020 tourism year depend on the speed on containment and the durations of travel restrictions and shut down the borders. And through the previous graphic, we can see that if the coronavirus go away faster or sooner, it would be better for the global tourism as a whole in 2020. But those scenarios, we can assess that into economic loss. So the UNWTO just translate the scenario into the economic loss. And then we can see it through the next graphic. Here it is through the next graphic. We can translate the scenarios into the loss of international tourism of 2020. Here it is. It is estimated that the loss of 850 million to 1.1 billion international tourists. And the second thing is loss of 910 billion US dollar to 1.2 trillion US dollar in export revenues from tourism. And then 100 to 120 million direct tourism job at risk. And we have to underline that domestic demand is expected to recover faster than international demand, according to UNWTO panel of experts survey. And the majority expects to see the sign of recovery by the final quarter of 2020, but mostly in 2021. So based on the previous crisis, leisure travel is expected to recover quicker, particularly travel for visiting friends and relatives other than business travels. And the source, of course, we gather it from the UNWTO in 2020. We just released the data. And the good news is some countries with the failing coronavirus cases just about to reopen their access from another country, and this is a good signal actually for the global tourism, as the global tourism may be in the normal conditions as soon as possible as the lockdown and the restrictions go easing. And we hope nothing but the best for the global tourism as a whole, and expect especially for Indonesia to be in the normal conditions again as soon as possible. Stay tuned to the market headlines because we'll be right back after this break.